The winter of 1980 along the Maine coastline was brutal, the kind of season where storms seemed to roll in one after another, erasing the line between sea and sky. Walter Briggs had lived most of his adult life out here, keeping the lighthouse running through rain, snow, and fog. He was 52 years old, steady-handed, and known by everyone in town as dependable to a fault. He wasn't just a lighthouse keeper. He was a man who took pride in his isolation, in maintaining a light that kept sailors safe when the ocean turned violent. Those who knew him well described him as meticulous, even obsessive about his duties. He had kept careful logs for decades, recording weather, supply deliveries, and even his thoughts when nights stretched long and lonely. He wasn't the type to lose focus, and he wasn't the type to vanish. But in the final days of February, something happened that would turn Walter from a man into a mystery whispered about for generations. On February 24th, a nor'easter swept up the Atlantic coast, pinning boats in harbor and cutting off the lighthouse from the mainland. For 3 days, no one could reach him. The storm pounded against the rocks, waves rising 40 feet at times, wind howling like a freight train across the cliffs. People in town thought little of it at first. Storms had always tested the lighthouse keepers, and Walter had weathered dozens just like this one. But when the skies finally cleared, and the supply boat made its way back out to the rocky spit where the tower stood, the men on board sensed almost immediately that something was wrong. The lighthouse loomed above them, as it always did, battered but unbroken, yet strangely quiet. No one came out to greet them, though Walter always made a point of signaling the supply crews. The boat's captain tied off and climbed the narrow ladder up the rock face, expecting to find him at the door. Instead, he found it locked from the inside. That alone raised questions, because Walter had no reason to lock himself in. When the men finally forced their way in through a side access, the scene inside was like something frozen in time. A kettle of water had long boiled away on the stove. A plate sat on the table with a knife beside it, half prepared as though a meal had been interrupted. On the floor, near the door, sat Walter's heavy boots, the ones he wore whenever he stepped outside onto the slick rocks. They were neatly placed side by side, as if waiting for him to return. But Walter himself was nowhere to be found. The supply men searched the tower from top to bottom, calling his name, expecting at any moment for him to answer from some corner. They checked the lantern room, the keeper's quarters, and the winding stairwell, but everything was in perfect order. The logbook was open on his desk with the last entry written in his careful handwriting the night before the storm broke. It noted the rising winds and poor visibility, nothing out of the ordinary. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no overturned furniture. It was as if Walter had simply vanished between 1 minute and the next. When word reached the mainland, suspicion spread fast. Some believed he had gone out into the storm, misjudged the strength of the waves, and been swept away. Others whispered that the sea had taken him in some more deliberate way, claiming a man who had lived too long on its edge. A few wondered whether he had grown tired of the solitude and walked away from his post, though the locked door and abandoned meal argued against it. His family was notified, and investigators were dispatched from the county sheriff's office. They, too, found themselves confounded by the details. A lighthouse, sealed from the inside, should have kept him safe. Instead, it had become a locked room without its keeper. The disappearance unsettled everyone in town. Walter had been part of the community for decades, reliable and unshakable. To imagine him gone without explanation left people uneasy. Fishermen muttered that the sea was reclaiming what it was owed, while others pointed out that Walter had no reason to leave behind his job, his wife, and the house he intended to return to after retirement. For those closest to him, the most haunting detail was the silence of the tower itself. The light continued to sweep across the water, steady and mechanical, but inside the man who had tended it for 30 years was gone. What remained were fragments of routine interrupted, signs of a life paused mid-step, and a locked door that offered no answers. Investigators would begin to unravel the puzzle, but in that first moment of discovery, all anyone could say was that Walter Briggs had disappeared from his post on the edge of the sea, leaving behind only questions and a storm-battered lighthouse that seemed to hold its own secrets. The disappearance of Walter Briggs drew more than curiosity. It drew urgency. Within 24 hours, deputies from the county sheriff's office, along with volunteers from the Coastal Rescue Service, arrived at the lighthouse by boat. They faced a difficult job from the beginning. The weather was still rough, with swells threatening to overturn smaller craft. But they knew if Walter had been swept into the water, every passing hour lessened the chance of recovery. They began by combing the rocky shoreline, scanning tide pools and inlets where a body might have washed up. Nets were dragged through the freezing shallows, and divers went into the water, battling the cold, searching beneath the crashing surf. What they found was nothing. No body, no clothing, no sign of Walter Briggs at all. Investigators moved their attention back to the lighthouse itself. The locked door continued to unsettle them. It was bolted from the inside, yet Walter was not there. Every window was intact, the glass unbroken, the sills unmarked. The spiral staircase showed no scuffs that would suggest a fall, and the lantern room at the top was in perfect order. If Walter had fallen from the height of the tower, they reasoned, his body would have been visible on the rocks below. But there was nothing. The ordinary orderliness of the place only deepened the sense that something unnatural had happened within its walls. Sheriff's deputies began questioning those who knew him. His wife described a steady man, not prone to despair, not reckless, and never careless with his duties. His neighbors said the same. He wasn't a drinker, he wasn't in debt, and he had no known enemies. The possibility of suicide seemed thin. There was no note, no signs of intention, no reason he would stage his departure by locking himself in and abandoning his meal. Investigators were reluctant to call it foul play either. There were no footprints, no foreign fingerprints, no trace of intrusion. Whoever had entered would have had to vanish without a trace, and the supply boat had been the first vessel to reach the rock since the storm began. It was then, while combing through Walter's personal items, that investigators came across his logbook. It was the kind of meticulous record every keeper was required to keep, but Walter had gone above and beyond, filling its margins with not just the usual measurements, but thoughts about the weather, the solitude, and sometimes even his health. Most of it was ordinary. Then, in the weeks before the storm, the tone shifted. Phrases appeared that troubled the investigators. Strange noise from the stairwell. Thought it was wind, but sounded like steps. Another entry, dated only days before his disappearance, read, "Footsteps at night again? Too heavy to be mine. Not sure if I am alone here." And then, most chilling of all, the last half page written before the storm struck. "He won't let me leave." The words unsettled everyone who read them. Investigators debated whether it was evidence of paranoia or whether Walter had indeed been experiencing something real. Some believed he may have been suffering the effects of isolation. Lighthouse keepers often endured long periods without contact, and it wasn't uncommon for them to report strange sensations, even hallucinations. Others feared it suggested someone else had been inside the lighthouse with him, someone who might have caused his disappearance. Yet the locked door, again, posed an impossible contradiction. If there had been another person, how had they escaped? As news of the strange logbook entries spread through town, theories multiplied. Some believed Walter had lost his grip on reality and thrown himself into the sea. Others began to wonder if the lighthouse itself held a secret, some hidden passage or chamber that investigators had missed. Deputies went back through the tower with lanterns and crowbars, tapping at walls, pulling at floorboards, but nothing revealed itself. The structure was sound, solid, and unremarkable, at least on the surface. Meanwhile, Walter's family was forced to live through every twist of speculation. His wife clung to the idea that something had happened beyond his control. She refused to believe he had abandoned her, nor did she believe he had taken his own life. Each time investigators returned empty-handed, her grief grew sharper. She wanted answers, but none came. The sea remained silent, the lighthouse kept its own watch, and Walter was gone. By the end of the second week, the case had reached a frustrating standstill. Searchers had covered every mile of shoreline within 5 miles. They found driftwood, wreckage from fishing boats, and debris washed in by the storm, but no trace of Walter Briggs. Deputies began filing their first official reports, which left the cause of disappearance as undetermined. Behind closed doors, they admitted privately that the logbook troubled them most. It suggested something they couldn't explain, a detail that gave the case a lingering sense of unease. But with no body and no evidence of crime, the investigation had nowhere to go. What remained were rumors, whispers of footsteps in the night, and the haunting words of a man who wrote of being trapped in his own station. The case might have ended there, filed away as an unsolved disappearance, but those final entries would echo in the minds of everyone who read them. They suggested a presence in the lighthouse, something unseen, and they ensured that Walter Briggs's disappearance would not fade quietly into the background. Instead, it would grow into legend, feeding questions that investigators could not answer and setting the stage for theories far darker than anyone could have imagined. As the search for Walter Briggs dragged into its third week with no answers, the tone in the small Maine community began to shift. What had started as an investigation turned into whispers, and what had been a disappearance became the foundation for stories that grew darker with each telling. The absence of a body gnawed at people's minds. If Walter had drowned, something should have surfaced by now. If he had left of his own will, someone should have spotted him on the mainland. Instead, there was nothing but silence, and in that silence, rumors thrived. In the diners and taverns near the docks, men spoke of him as if he had been lured into the ocean. Old sailors leaned close and swore they had heard of such things before. Keepers who lived too long on the edge of storms claimed not by accident, but by the sea itself. Some told stories of ghostly crews, sailors who had drowned a century before, calling to Walter in the howling wind, leading him out into the night until he stepped barefoot into the waves. Others scoffed at that, saying he was a man who had tired of his lonely life and staged the most dramatic escape he could imagine, locking himself in and slipping away unseen. The theories, though outlandish, carried weight because they filled a void left by the lack of facts. The lighthouse itself soon became a character in the stories. Fishermen passing near the cliffs at night claimed to see strange lights flickering not from the beacon, but lower, along the rocks where no one should be standing. A few swore they heard voices drifting across the water, faint shouts swallowed by the wind. Each account was shared in hushed tones, and each one added to the growing legend that the lighthouse was cursed. When supply crews arrived for their scheduled runs, they began working faster, less willing to linger after dark. No one wanted to be left alone on the rocks. For Walter's wife, the talk was unbearable. She returned again and again to the sheriff's office, demanding that they keep searching, insisting her husband was not a man who would run. She argued that he had been looking forward to retirement, to finally leaving the isolation of the lighthouse behind. Friends recalled that he had been making plans for repairs to their home, even setting aside money for a small trip they had talked about for years. Nothing about his life suggested he was preparing to vanish. Yet her voice, though steady at first, could not drown out the tide of speculation. With each passing day, fewer people believed he would be found alive, and more began repeating the stories that painted him as either a victim of the supernatural or a man who had simply abandoned everything. The rumors hardened into local folklore. Children dared each other to walk the shoreline at night, saying Walter's ghost would appear, boots in hand, searching for a way back into the locked lighthouse. Others claimed he had never left the tower at all, that his spirit wandered its stairwells, keeping a watch long after his body was gone. Sailors who had no patience for superstition dismissed all of it as nonsense, yet even they admitted there was something unnerving about the case. A man could fall, drown, or vanish in 100 ways on the water, but the locked door, the neat pair of boots, and the logbook entries spoke of a deeper strangeness. The sheriff, confronted with the town's growing unease, tried to reassure the public. He reminded people that isolation could play tricks on the mind, and that strange entries in a logbook might not mean anything more than fatigue or illness. But few were convinced. The community had lived with storms their entire lives, and men like Walter had always been seen as the steady anchors against that chaos. If he could vanish in such a way, it meant none of them were as safe as they believed. The press, too, played its part. Local papers printed stories about the mystery keeper of the lighthouse, emphasizing the eerie details and stoking interest from beyond the town. Tourists began asking about the disappearance, stopping by the docks to hear first-hand accounts from anyone willing to speak. For some, it was an opportunity to sell a story, but for others, it was a reminder that what had been a personal tragedy was now entertainment for strangers. Walter's family, still waiting for answers, felt his memory slipping from fact into legend, and they hated it. By the end of spring, the town had settled into two camps. One believed Walter had met with a tragic accident, swept into the waves, his body lost to currents too strong for anyone to predict. The other believed something darker had taken place, whether by his own design or by forces no one could name. Neither side had proof, but the lack of resolution left the entire community divided. Each retelling grew more exaggerated, and each year the story spread further, until Walter Briggs was no longer just a missing man, but a symbol of the sea's mysteries, a warning whispered to anyone who thought they understood the ocean's edge. Still, for those closest to him, there was only grief. His wife continued to wait for word that never came, clinging to the belief that he had not abandoned her, that the stories painting him as a deserter were cruel distortions of the truth. She pleaded with people to remember the man he was, diligent, loyal, and proud of his work, but with no body to bury and no answers from the investigation. Her voice was drowned out. What remained was an unsettled town, a grieving family, and a story that refused to rest. The lighthouse kept shining, automated now, its beams sweeping across the black water like nothing had happened at all. But everyone who looked at it saw something different, a tower that had consumed its own keeper, leaving behind not answers but questions that would only deepen in the years ahead. And as time passed, those questions would prove impossible to forget, ensuring that Walter's disappearance would never fade quietly, but instead echo in the form of legends that grew more unsettling with each generation. By the end of 1980, the investigation into Walter Briggs's disappearance had already grown thin. Deputies had interviewed every fisherman who might have passed the rocks, every supply man who had contact with him in the weeks before he vanished, and even drifters who had been seen on the mainland docks during that winter. Nothing connected. The logbook entries, unsettling as they were, offered no physical proof of anything more than a man's private thoughts. The locked room baffled investigators but left no avenue forward. It was, as one officer described in his final report, a case that begins with a closed door and ends with nothing at all. For Walter's family, hope lingered longer than the official search. His wife wrote letters to the Coast Guard, to state police, even to federal agencies, begging them not to give up, but each reply was the same. Without new evidence, without a body, there was nothing more they could do. Volunteers who had once combed the shoreline moved on to other duties. The tide had reclaimed the storm debris, washing away what little might have been left behind. The silence became unbearable, and in that silence, grief calcified into routine. She kept his belongings, waiting for the call that never came, telling herself he might still walk back into their home, even as years passed. Meanwhile, the lighthouse continued its work. Another keeper was assigned to replace Walter, but from the beginning, it was clear the place carried a shadow. The new man lasted only a few months before requesting transfer, reporting that he couldn't stand the nights alone, that he kept hearing banging sounds echoing through the walls. Another took his place, and then another, but none lasted long. Word spread quietly through the ranks that the station was cursed, that whatever had taken Walter still lingered. Some spoke of locked doors rattling in the middle of the night, of a sound like footsteps climbing the spiral stairs when no one else was there. Officially, nothing was ever logged about these incidents, but off the record, the keepers talked. By the mid-1980s, the case had gone cold. Files sat in a cabinet at the sheriff's office, gathering dust, revisited only when a new deputy stumbled upon them and asked about the strange story of the vanished caretaker. The older officers shrugged, repeating the same line. They had searched, they had investigated, and in the end, the sea had swallowed its secrets. When Walter was finally declared legally dead 7 years after his disappearance, the paperwork closed more than just a file. It closed hope. His wife received the death certificate, her grief now bound by law, though her questions remained unanswered. The town moved on, at least outwardly, but the story never really faded. It lingered in whispered conversations at the dock and in the unease people felt whenever they looked toward the tower at night. Parents warned their children not to wander too close to the cliffs, not just because of the danger of the rocks, but because they didn't want to risk them hearing what some swore could still be heard there, the faint banging, like someone trapped inside trying to get out. By the late 1980s, as automation began to creep into lighthouses up and down the coast, the station became harder to staff. Each new keeper stayed for shorter stretches, complaining of the isolation or requesting transfer after reporting unease they couldn't explain. Rumors grew that some doors within the station refused to stay closed, swinging shut on their own or rattling as if something unseen pressed against them. Few wanted to speak about it publicly, but among the men who served there, Walter's name was invoked often. He was no longer just a missing man, he was the reason many refused long shifts, a reminder that the lighthouse kept secrets that no one wanted to uncover. In official terms, the disappearance was little more than a line in an archive. The sheriff's office kept a box marked with Walter's name, containing the few belongings taken from the lighthouse, the copied pages of his logbook, and the incident reports filed by deputies who had long since retired. No one reopened the case. It was mentioned occasionally in local newspapers, usually in the form of anniversary pieces that rehashed the same details. A man gone without a trace, a locked lighthouse, and no body ever recovered. Readers glanced at the articles, shook their heads, and moved on. But in the back of people's minds, the mystery never lost its edge. For the family, life became a long negotiation with absence. His wife never remarried, never moved away. She kept his chair, his books, even his watch on the mantel. Each time a new story circulated about strange noises at the lighthouse, it cut her open again. She fought against the rumors, insisting to anyone who would listen that Walter had been a good man, reliable and sane, not the kind of person who would vanish or haunt anyone. But her voice grew softer as the years stretched on, drowned out by the larger narrative of a legend that had taken root in the town. By the early 1990s, Walter Briggs was no longer just a man who had disappeared. He was a cautionary tale, a ghost story, and a mystery no one could solve. His name lived on in whispers, in the nervous glances of new lighthouse keepers, in the sense that something had been left unresolved. Officially, the file was closed, abandoned in the archives of a county office. Unofficially, the story remained alive, unsettled, waiting in the shadows of the lighthouse where he had last been seen. And though the case was left behind by investigators, the sense of unease it created was not. That unease would linger long after the paperwork was forgotten, a reminder that some locked doors refused to stay silent forever. By the mid-1990s, the old lighthouse no longer needed a human hand to keep its light burning. Automation had swept the coast, and stations once staffed by men like Walter Briggs were now run by machinery, timers, and silent backup systems. The decision was practical, but for the people who had grown up seeing keepers on the rocks, it felt like the end of an era. When the day came, officials closed the doors, sealed the station, and walked away. The light still flashed its steady rhythm across the Atlantic, but the heartbeat of the tower, the men who lived inside its stone walls, was gone. The years were not kind to the building. Salt spray corroded the metal railings, storms battered the paint, and the windows grew clouded with grime. Without anyone there to oil the gears or patch the leaks, the lighthouse began to decay. The spiral staircase rusted at the joints, the wooden floors warped, and the once bright lantern room dulled to a shadow of what it had been. Yet the structure endured, standing against the sea in silence. Inside, everything remained as it had been left, frozen in time, including its locked doors and forgotten corners. In town, Walter's story shifted once more. With no new evidence, the disappearance settled firmly into folklore. Tourists who came through in summer heard the tale at restaurants and along the docks. Locals recounted how a keeper had vanished from a locked room, his boots still by the door, never to be seen again. Some embellished the details, claiming his shadow could still be seen in the windows, or that on stormy nights the light faltered as if mourning him. For the townsfolk, telling the story became almost a tradition. It was easier to wrap it in myth than to sit with the grief of unsolved loss. Children dared each other to walk the shoreline at dusk, pointing to the tower and whispering about Walter's ghost. A few even swore they saw movement in the lantern room, though everyone knew the building had been sealed for years. Fishermen, hardened by decades at sea, admitted they felt uneasy sailing past it. They said the place carried an energy that hadn't been there before, a heaviness in the air that reminded them of the storm the night Walter disappeared. Whether it was memory or imagination, they could never say for sure, but none lingered near the rocks longer than necessary. The sheriff's files gathered dust. Walter's case was rarely spoken of by law enforcement, though from time to time a young deputy would stumble on the folder, flip through the reports, and wonder how a man could vanish so completely from a locked building. The logbook with its strange entries, footsteps at night, and the chilling line, "He won't let me leave," sat tucked away in evidence storage, its handwriting still crisp, its mystery still unresolved. But no one reopened the file. Officially, the case was long closed. Unofficially, it lived on in whispers. Walter's wife aged quietly. She outlived most of those who remembered him best. And though she never stopped believing something had gone terribly wrong that night, she stopped speaking about it publicly. To her, the lighthouse was not a ghost story, but a wound that never healed. She passed away before the century turned, never knowing what had really happened inside those stone walls. By then, the building itself had become part of the scenery, another relic fading into disrepair, standing watch over an ocean that had taken countless lives but never returned Walter's. By the early 2000s, the lighthouse was more ruin than monument, its paint peeled in long strips, its door hinges seized with rust, and weeds pushed through cracks in the foundation. Birds nested in the lantern room, leaving droppings on the machinery that once shone brighter than the sun. Storm after storm crashed against it, but still it stood, a silent witness to a mystery locked inside. The town carried on, but every so often, when someone asked about the tower, the old story came back. A caretaker who vanished into thin air, a locked lighthouse, and no answers. For most, the tale had dulled into a curiosity, a campfire story for tourists, and a footnote in local history books. But the truth remained that no one had ever gone back inside since the day it was sealed. The lighthouse was untouched, left to rot in silence, its doors closed tight against wind and weather. If anything remained inside, whether belongings, forgotten notes, or secrets, they had been left undisturbed for decades. The building was a capsule of time, waiting, and that was what made the silence so heavy. For 30 years, the lighthouse loomed over the water, carrying with it an unanswered question. Locals grew used to pointing it out, used to reciting the legend, but in the back of their minds lingered the thought that the truth was still there, behind its locked doors, untouched by anyone since Walter Briggs had vanished. What no one could have imagined was that one day the building would be opened again, and when it was, the answers that had been buried for decades would finally come to light. For decades, the lighthouse stood abandoned, weathered by storms and salt, until by 2013 it had become a crumbling landmark on the edge of the Maine coast. Locals had grown used to seeing it in disrepair, but preservation groups had begun looking for ways to save such historic structures before they were lost forever. That summer, a non-profit dedicated to maritime history secured funding to restore the tower. Their goal was to stabilize it, repair its exterior, and reopen it to the public as a museum. What began as a project rooted in history would soon become a reopening of old wounds the town had long since buried. Crews arrived by boat hauling scaffolding, lumber, and tools up the same narrow steps where Walter Briggs had once walked. The interior was worse than they expected. Wooden floors had rotted through, paint peeled in sheets, and nests of gulls and rodents had filled entire rooms. Workers wore masks against the mold as they stripped debris, clearing one floor after another. But as they descended into the lower levels, they came across something unusual, a section of stone wall that didn't quite match the rest of the foundation. The masonry looked newer, less weathered, and when tapped, it gave off a hollow sound. The crew initially thought it was just a repair job from decades past, but when they checked the old blueprints of the lighthouse, the space didn't exist. According to the plans, there should have been a narrow secondary staircase there, one that led to a lower chamber built as a storm shelter back in the 19th century. Yet here it was, sealed tight, bricks layered carefully over what had once been an opening. The foreman reported the find, and soon the workers began chipping away at the wall. Beneath the bricks, their hammers struck cold iron. A heavy door emerged, its surface rusted and streaked from decades of damp air. Its bolts were fused shut, its hinges locked in place. The discovery quickly made its way back to town. Old-timers muttered that it was exactly what they had suspected, that the lighthouse still held a part of Walter Briggs inside it. Others insisted it was nothing more than a forgotten repair, a sealed chamber that had collapsed or flooded long ago. But the timing was uncanny. For 33 years, the disappearance had remained a closed file, a local ghost story. Now, with the iron door revealed, the story was alive again. Reporters from regional papers arrived, their headlines dusting off the legend of the vanished keeper. Interviews with townsfolk revived all the old rumors. Walter fleeing into the sea, Walter lured by voices, Walter locked away in some hidden place beneath the tower. Journalists pulled the files from archives, retelling the eerie details, the boots by the door, the half-prepared meal, and the logbook entry that ended with the words, "He won't let me leave." They asked the sheriff's department if the discovery of the sealed door meant the case might be reopened, but the department was cautious. They had no evidence that the chamber had anything to do with Walter, and decades of folklore had only made the story murkier. Still, as the door stood in the open air for the first time in decades, pressure mounted for someone to open it. Preservationists hesitated. They worried about safety, about the stability of the chamber, about whether forcing it open could collapse part of the foundation. But the public's attention was fixed. Families who had grown up with the story wanted closure. Younger generations wanted proof of the ghost stories they had heard all their lives. Some believed the chamber would reveal nothing more than storm damage, a flooded storage room, a collapsed passage, maybe old tools left behind. Others whispered that it might hold something far more disturbing, perhaps even the body of Walter Briggs himself. The town became divided again, just as it had in 1980. To some, opening the door meant finally laying the rumors to rest, no matter what was found inside. To others, it meant disturbing something that had been sealed for a reason. Theories spilled into every corner of conversation. People recalled how earlier keepers had spoken of strange noises in the walls, of banging that could not be explained. What if Walter had discovered something down there? What if he had been trapped? The preservation crew stalled, unsure of how to proceed. But once the story reached regional news stations, there was no turning back. Journalists filmed the rusted door, capturing its foreboding presence, the way it seemed to hold its own silence even as workers hammered around it. Interviews with locals replayed the old grief of Walter's family, the unease of fishermen who still sailed past the lighthouse, and the questions that had lingered for more than 3 decades. In the end, the decision to open the chamber was inevitable. Engineers assessed the structure, declaring it safe enough, though the door would have to be forced. A date was set. For the first time since Walter Briggs vanished, the community would return to the lighthouse not as a relic of the past, but as the center of an unfolding mystery. The door that had been hidden for generations was now in plain view, and everyone, locals, preservationists, and journalists alike, held their breath for what lay beyond it. The day the preservation team finally forced the door open, the town seemed to hold its breath. For weeks, speculation had built like pressure in a boiler, and now the rusted bolts that had sealed the chamber for decades were all that stood between silence and revelation. The workers fought with crowbars and hammers, their tools ringing against iron that had not moved since the late 1800s. Every strike echoed through the hollow lighthouse like a drumbeat, drawing onlookers closer. The bolts groaned, cracked, and finally sheared off one by one. When the last hinge gave way, the air that rushed out was stale and suffocating, the stench of decay mixed with rust and damp stone. Lanterns and flashlights lit the darkness inside, revealing a chamber no one alive had ever seen. At first, it looked like nothing more than a forgotten storage space, dusty, narrow, and damp. But then their eyes adjusted, and the details began to emerge. In the center sat a small wooden chair, tilted slightly to one side, its legs warped with age. Beside it lay an overturned lantern, the glass long shattered, rust spreading across its frame. On the stone walls, faint but unmistakable, were long, desperate scratches etched deep into the surface by fingernails or some improvised tool. The workers fell silent, and then they saw the figure on the floor. Slumped against the far wall was a skeleton, its clothing tattered but recognizable as the uniform of a lighthouse keeper from decades before. The fabric, though faded, still bore traces of the dark blue work coat issued to men like Walter Briggs. The body was positioned as though it had slid down the wall in its final moments, knees bent, hands curled against the floor. The skull was tilted downward, empty sockets fixed on the cold stone. It was a sight that froze every man in place. For 33 years, the town had debated, speculated, and invented legends. Now, here was something real, something that seemed to answer the unanswerable. The chamber fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of dripping water. Some of the workers stepped back, shaken, while others lingered, staring as though they couldn't believe what they were seeing. One man muttered that it had to be Walter, that there was no other explanation, but others weren't so sure. Why would he have been in a sealed chamber that had been bricked over? How could he have gotten inside when the door had been fused shut for decades? And why had no one heard him if indeed he had died trapped beneath the lighthouse? The preservation foreman quickly reported the discovery, and within hours the sheriff's office, now led by a younger generation of deputies, was on site. They cordoned off the chamber, treating it as a crime scene despite the years that had passed. Photographs were taken of the skeleton, the scratched walls, and the overturned lantern. The room was measured, mapped, and documented. Forensic specialists were called to recover the remains carefully, lifting each fragile bone with gloved hands, placing them into bags and cases as if Walter had only just been found. For the town, it was a moment that blurred the line between folklore and reality. News spread quickly. Locals who had grown up with the story of the vanished keeper crowded the docks, whispering that the mystery had finally been solved. The headline wrote itself, "Skeleton found in Lighthouse may be missing keeper." For Walter's surviving relatives, nieces, nephews, distant cousins, the news brought shock and a measure of grim relief. They had lived their lives under the shadow of a story that was never complete, and now there was something tangible, something that could at least be buried. But for investigators, the discovery only raised more questions than it answered. The condition of the chamber suggested Walter had been alive when he entered. The overturned lantern hinted he had tried to use it, perhaps in panic. The scratches on the walls told of desperation, of someone clawing for escape in the dark. Yet the iron door, sealed by brick, argued that no one could have entered or exited once it was shut. Had Walter stumbled into the room before it was sealed, only to be trapped when the door jammed behind him? Or had someone bricked it over while he was still inside? That possibility unsettled everyone who heard it, for it suggested not an accident, but something deliberate, something far darker. The skeleton's posture, the scratch marks, and the remnants of clothing all painted a haunting picture. A man alone, trapped, fighting until his last breath. And as workers and investigators stood in the chamber, they couldn't shake the thought that for decades, while people told stories of Walter's ghost wandering the cliffs, his body had been here the whole time, locked just a few feet from where rescuers had searched in vain. What struck the town most was the eerie connection to Walter's final logbook entries. His words about footsteps in the night, about someone who wouldn't let him leave, seemed to echo in the chamber. The scratches on the wall became their own kind of writing, a silent message carved in stone that spoke of entrapment and fear. For many, it confirmed the chilling suspicion that Walter had not simply vanished, but had died in torment beneath the very place he had dedicated his life to protecting. The chamber was sealed once more after the body was removed, but the discovery could not be undone. The lighthouse, once just a decaying monument to the past, was now the center of renewed scrutiny, the site of a confirmed death. People wondered aloud what else the structure might be hiding, what other secrets had been walled away. And though the skeleton was likely Walter Briggs, confirmation would take time. Forensic testing was required, and until those results came back, the town held its breath again, caught between shock, grief, and the fear that what they had uncovered was not just a body, but the beginning of a darker truth. The skeleton was taken from the lighthouse under the same procedures reserved for modern crime scenes, even though more than 3 decades had passed since Walter Briggs disappeared. Every bone was carefully catalogued, every scrap of fabric bagged, every trace of soil and debris sealed for testing. The remains were transported to a state forensic lab, where experts began the meticulous process of determining who the man in the chamber truly was. For the town, there was little doubt, but the investigators wanted proof. After 33 years of rumor and speculation, there would be no shortcuts. The first breakthrough came quickly. Dental records from Walter's file were retrieved, and forensic dentists compared them against the teeth that had survived in the skull. The match was unmistakable. The man found in the hidden chamber was indeed Walter Briggs, the lighthouse keeper who had vanished in 1980. For his surviving relatives, the news was both a confirmation and a wound reopened. The uncertainty of his fate had stretched across generations, but hearing it confirmed that his body had been within the lighthouse all along brought a new kind of grief. He had not walked into the sea, he had not abandoned his life. He had died alone, just feet from where rescuers had once searched. Yet the identification only sharpened the mystery. Forensic anthropologists examined his bones carefully, looking for signs of violence, trauma, or poisoning. There were none. His skeletal remains bore no fractures consistent with a struggle, no evidence of sharp force or blunt force injury. Toxicology tests on the trace samples of bone marrow and hair revealed no foreign substances, no toxins, no signs of deliberate harm. By all measurable accounts, Walter Briggs had not been murdered. He had not been poisoned, struck, or drowned. He had simply been alive in that chamber until he was not. That conclusion troubled investigators more than it comforted them. If there had been no foul play, then how had Walter ended up behind a sealed iron door, trapped in a chamber that was bricked over? The idea that someone else had entombed him there became harder to support without any trace of injury. Slowly, another theory began to take shape, one that was both more mundane and more horrifying. The old blueprints of the lighthouse confirmed that the chamber had once been used as a storm shelter. It was possible that on the night of the nor'easter in 1980, Walter had gone down to inspect it, or to use it as intended, bringing his lantern with him into the darkness. Perhaps the heavy iron door, swollen with rust, had swung shut behind him. Perhaps the lock had jammed, trapping him inside. The scratches on the wall supported this theory, each one marking his desperation as he tried to claw his way out. The overturned lantern suggested he had been fighting even in the dark, trying to signal or pry open the door. His logbook entries in the weeks before the storm gained new weight. The references to footsteps, to someone not letting him leave, no longer sounded like the ramblings of a man losing his mind. They sounded like the warnings of someone who had discovered a flaw in the place he lived, a flaw that he feared could trap him. To modern investigators, it seemed plausible that Walter had felt uneasy about the chamber long before that night, as though he sensed what it might mean if he ever found himself locked inside. For the sheriff's office, reopening the case meant confronting not a crime, but a tragedy. Walter Briggs had not been killed by another person. He had been killed by circumstance, by a hidden design flaw in the very building he had been tasked with tending. The nor'easter had raged outside, and all the while he had been inside, clawing at the walls, unheard, unseen, dying in silence as the sea swallowed the sound of his struggle. The world had searched the waves and the shoreline, while the man they sought lay locked behind iron and brick. This revelation hit the town harder than any ghost story. It stripped away the legends of spirits and vanished sailors and left behind the stark reality of a man trapped within stone walls. Locals who had told the story as folklore for years now spoke in hushed tones about how close he had been, how rescuers had stood only feet away from him, never knowing. Fishermen admitted that the thought of Walter scratching at the walls while they sailed past left them sleepless. For his family, it was a cruel twist. He had been there all along, but they had been forced to endure decades of doubt, of whispers that he had abandoned them, when the truth was that he had fought to return until the end. Still, even with the forensic findings, questions lingered. Why had the chamber been bricked over if it was once intended as a shelter? Was it sealed long before Walter ever entered, or could someone have closed it deliberately? The lack of injuries suggested no one had attacked him, but the possibility that he had been accidentally entombed by human hands could not be ruled out entirely. It was a detail that kept investigators uneasy, though no definitive proof could be found. The answers, partial as they were, reframed everything. Walter Briggs had not been a ghost, not a deserter, not a man swallowed by the sea. He had been a man undone by the very structure he had devoted his life to maintaining. For 33 years, his story had been one of mystery and legend. Now it was a story of isolation, of silence, and of how easily a man could vanish when the world looked in the wrong direction. And yet, though his remains had been identified and his cause of death narrowed, the investigation was far from finished. There were still details to unearth, still hours of his final struggle to piece together. Forensic experts could provide facts, but only the story of those last moments could reveal the depth of what Walter had endured inside that chamber. That story was only beginning to emerge, and it would be darker still. Once the remains were confirmed to be Walter Briggs, the focus shifted from who he was to how he had spent his final hours. Historians and forensic investigators worked side by side, determined to reconstruct the chain of events that had led to his death in the hidden chamber. It was a grim task, piecing together the life and death of a man who had been missing for 33 years, but the evidence that remained began to paint a chillingly clear picture. The key breakthrough came when maritime historians uncovered old blueprints of the Lighthouse, drawn more than a century earlier. According to the records, the chamber where Walter had been found was never meant to be a mystery. It had originally been built as an emergency storm shelter, a reinforced space designed to withstand high winds and waves that could batter the structure during the worst nor'easters. Early keepers had used it to ride out violent weather, but by the mid-20th century, it had fallen out of use. New safety measures, better communication equipment, and more durable construction made it obsolete. Sometime later, likely during a round of renovations, the access to the chamber was sealed with brick, the door left to rust in silence. The records did not say why. Armed with this information, investigators began piecing together what Walter might have done on the night of his disappearance. The nor'easter had roared in with winds strong enough to shake the tower itself. Walter, ever cautious, may have gone down to inspect the shelter, perhaps thinking to secure supplies or simply to check the old chamber in case conditions worsened. He carried his lantern, descended the steps, and pushed open the heavy iron door. At some point, whether by accident or by the force of the storm shaking the building, the door swung shut behind him. Theories suggest the rusted lock, long neglected, jammed immediately. Walter would have reached for the handle, twisted, pushed, pulled, but the swollen metal refused to move. His lantern fell, shattering, leaving him in darkness. The sound of the storm outside would have been deafening, wind screaming through cracks, waves smashing against the rocks, thunder rolling overhead. He shouted, perhaps at first believing someone might hear. But no one did. The storm drowned out every cry, and the lighthouse stood isolated, unreachable until the skies cleared. Forensic details gave more weight to this reconstruction. The scratches on the walls, some deep and frantic, suggested long hours of struggle. He had tried to claw his way out, marking stone with desperate hands. The overturned chair may have been used to strike the door, leaving faint dents that experts could still detect. He fought with everything he had, but the chamber was unforgiving. There was no radio, no window, no way to signal. Once inside, he was sealed in a tomb of stone and iron. Investigators also turned back to his logbook. The entries from the weeks leading up to the storm, once dismissed as the ramblings of a man unraveling in isolation, now took on an ominous resonance. He had written of hearing footsteps at night, of feeling as though he was not alone. The most haunting entry, "He won't let me leave," seemed almost prophetic. Some believe those words reflected his unease about the chamber itself, as though he had already tested its door and felt the resistance, sensed the danger of being trapped. Others suggest they were the early signs of paranoia, born from years of solitude. But when placed alongside the reality of his final hours, they seemed less like paranoia and more like a warning to himself. Psychologists consulted on the case noted that Walter may have experienced hallucinations in his final hours. Prolonged isolation, combined with darkness, dehydration, and the roar of the storm above, could easily have blurred the line between reality and imagination. He might have believed someone, or something, was in the chamber with him, keeping him from escape. The footsteps he had written about may have been echoes of his own movements, distorted by the acoustics of the stone walls. His mind, desperate and fading, could have turned these sensations into the presence of another. In that sense, his final words were tragically literal. He was not allowed to leave, not by another person, but by the iron door that held him captive. This reconstruction left the community stunned. For decades, they had imagined Walter being swept into the ocean, walking away from his life, or caught in some act of foul play. To realize instead that he had been trapped beneath their feet, struggling for hours, perhaps days, while they searched the coastline, was devastating. It was not a story of vanishing into thin air, but of being silenced within stone, of a man dying slowly while the world looked in the wrong place. The thought that he may have hallucinated in those final moments only deepened the unease. Fishermen who had grown up telling tales of his ghost now admitted that maybe the haunting had been real. Not a spirit, but the echo of a man's final panic, etched into the chamber by his last desperate actions. His scratches on the walls were more permanent than words, a record of his will to live that outlasted his body. The investigation, though able to provide answers, did not deliver comfort. It revealed the fragility of a man's life against the weight of stone, the futility of struggle against a locked door. For Walter's family, the truth was brutal. Hy had not left them. He had fought to return, and in those hours of darkness he had been as close to home as he had ever been, but just out of reach. And yet, even with this chilling picture of his final hours, one question remained. Why had the chamber been sealed in the first place, and why had it remained forgotten for so long? The answer to that would determine whether Walter's death was a tragic accident of history, or something that had been waiting for him all along. When the findings were finally announced, the town fell silent. After 33 years of speculation, the truth was revealed in blunt clinical terms. Walter Briggs had not walked into the sea. He had not fled from his life, and he had not been the victim of some shadowy hand. He had been locked alive inside a forgotten chamber beneath the lighthouse, trapped in a storm shelter that no one remembered existed. For more than 3 decades, his body had remained there in silence, hidden behind brick and iron while rescuers scoured the wrong places. The revelation spread quickly, first through local news and then across national outlets. Headlines captured the stark irony of it: a man lost in plain sight, just feet from safety. For locals who had repeated the ghost stories for years, the discovery was sobering. The lighthouse had not been haunted by Walter's spirit. It had held his body, undisturbed, within walls that no one thought to question. The stories of footsteps and banging, the rumors of shadows in the tower, all seemed less like folklore now and more like echoes of what had actually happened in those final hours. For Walter's family, the truth was both a comfort and a cruelty. They could finally bury him properly, give him the dignity of a grave, and silence the whispers that he had abandoned them. But the knowledge of how close he had been, how rescuers had stood above him, how his wife had prayed for his return while he lay only feet away, was a wound that no closure could heal. It was not the sea that had stolen him, but the very place he had guarded with loyalty for decades. The lighthouse itself became the symbol of that tragedy. Preservationists who had once envisioned turning it into a museum debated whether it should remain sealed instead, left as a memorial to the man it had claimed. Some argued that reopening it would dishonor his struggle, while others believed the story should be told in full, that visitors should see the chamber where he spent his last hours. In either case, the building was no longer just a relic of maritime history. It was a monument to a life lost in silence, a reminder of how easily truth can be hidden by stone and time. Even years after the discovery, people continued to wrestle with the details. If the chamber was meant to be sealed, why had the door not been removed entirely? If Walter knew of its dangers, why had he entered it during the storm? Historians insisted it was likely an accident, the kind of cruel twist that happens when old structures outlive their designs. But some residents could not let go of the idea that someone had bricked it over deliberately, knowingly entombing a space that still held use. Without proof, the question remained unanswered, another layer of unease atop the truth already uncovered. What no one denied, however, was that the story had finally shifted from mystery to tragedy. The town no longer spoke of Walter as a ghost or a deserter. They spoke of him as a man who had endured the worst fate imaginable, being close enough to salvation that the world mistook him for gone. His legend was replaced by his reality, a tale far darker and far more human than the folklore that had replaced him. And in that way, the lighthouse's silence was broken at last. For 33 years, Walter Briggs was remembered as the man who vanished into thin air, the keeper stolen by the sea. But when the chamber was opened, when the skeleton was lifted from the floor where it had lain for decades, that legend collapsed. The sea had never taken him, the ocean had not claimed his life. It was the lighthouse itself, the very structure he had been sworn to protect, that had become his prison. That truth, though final, was more haunting than any ghost story, and it would linger in the minds of all who heard it long after the chamber was sealed once again.